Hey everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Fire These Times. I'm your host, Elia Ayoub. Today I'm joined by my friend Ayman Makarem of Politically Depressed to talk about the so-called Ceuta incident, i.e. the opening of the border of the Spanish enclave in North Africa from the Moroccan side, the resulting sort of, I don't know what you want to call it, exodus or whatnot of like up to 50,000 people, the vast majority of whom have already been sent back. The 57 people, at least as far as we know now, that have died. And also, given that like this is the Fire These Times and it's not, a journalism podcast necessarily, talk about the talk about like how it's been discussed, the discourse around it, that sort of thing. Let's start with some intros, Ayman. If folks haven't heard of you before, would you mind introducing yourself?
Sure. Hello. Thanks for having me. I'm pretty sure a lot of people probably do know me because I think where our audiences kind of intersect.
I think so,
I'm
yes.
Ayman Makarem. Yeah. My name is Ayman Makarem. I'm a writer and video essayist from Beirut. I'm also an organizer. I've been doing this YouTube channel now where I do video essay kind of deep dive analyses on many different topics: capitalism, Zionism, feminism and revolution, and yeah, just happy to be here and talk about some of the reflections because we obviously talk about this stuff anyway on the side, and I think we have stuff to share about this.
Yeah, I guess it's fair to say, I don't think you would disagree, that we've both been bothered, personally profoundly bothered, by a lot of the discourse around what happened for different reasons. Like in some ways there's like the usual suspects, like the far right is gonna call it an invasion. That doesn't even shock me at this point, like whatever. I mean, what, not whatever, but like in the sense that it's still very consequential, but it's hardly a surprise that this is just the refrain that they're going to use. They don't have any other cards anyway. And it does work to some extent because it looks dramatic. It looks quite literally like the gates were open, which quite literally they were, because it's a fenced off enclave, and a bunch of people ran into this Spanish enclave, and the resulting discourses, it's not really one, some of which, the one I just mentioned, hasn't been surprising. Others have been maybe a bit more surprising, but equally, personally anyway, like disturbing. And of course, there's stuff in between. There are also people that have had nuanced takes, and there's been healthy conversations and whatnot. But given the nature of these things these days, especially with like the dominance of social media and whatnot, especially like this social media 2.0, 3.0, 4.0, whichever point 0 we're at now, it just felt very, very toxic so quickly. I don't know
Very
what
quickly.
has your reflections been.
No, I mean, it's basically that. I also find the language of takes indicative of the problem because there's this rush to get a take and
Yeah.
to state a take and to then consume the take and then to critique the take on the take and whatever.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And so before I think anyone really understood what was happening, there was just this immediate impulse to fit it within a narrative that already exists. Even though I noticed a lot of people did not understand that this wasn't, a bunch of migrants entering the Iberian Peninsula. It's how a lot of people interpreted it when it was like the Moroccan-Spanish border, that
Yeah.
this is an enclave within North Africa. But then also, there is that rush to quickly explain a thing before understanding it. And that to me is so indicative of the problems with social media. And yes, this 2.0, 3.0, wherever, but also like Instagram, where it is more of a visual thing and there's not really much space for actual discussion or be like, can we slow down and actually try and understand, like, wait, what? The narratives came up instantly. And the first reports of it that I saw, and I was up very late at night as it was happening, were just, oh, this is clearly Israel punishing Spain for recognizing Palestine. And we will talk about this. Like, there's clearly something going on here. This isn't like a spontaneous act or whatever. There's something coordinated at some level. But before we even get to that, just there's that instant confidence, of like, there's this narrative that we understand. How do we understand Spain as pro-Palestine? How do we understand Morocco as, a puppet of the the Americans, but the Israelis as well by
Hmm.
proxy. And so I find that very problematic because I'm such a boring person these days because I'm just all about, can we talk to understand first and like lay out the terms, lay out what are we talking about, and like actually have some basis. I made a post on my Instagram and one person did comment this exact thing, and I said like, he's like, oh, this is clearly a plot by the Israelis and whatever to punish Spain. And all I asked him was, okay, I've heard that. Do you have any evidence for that? That's a pretty wild claim. And he responded, again, very indicatively, lol, bro, it's all over the internet.
Yeah.
And it's just, yeah, that's
The
not
memes
really an
have the
argument.
memes have followed out has fo- ha, sorry, the memes have followed us. Like this is the cliche of 10 years ago. It's just now it's the norm. And for me, like, as someone who like I've written, other than the both of us being migrants from Lebanon, this not necessarily relevant to this specific conversation, other than personally how it felt seeing the demonization of mostly brown people and black people and so on. But as someone who's written about the EU's extraterritorial border control, it's not surprising that Morocco did this because previous governments have also did this. Morocco hasn't, it's not even the first time that Morocco itself does this. But whether it's Turkey, whether it's Lebanon, Syria, as far as I know, this current government hasn't done it yet, but they're not there. They may not be far off. Lebanon, 2 or 3 years ago, got €1 billion from the EU on that premise of saying like we need help like because if you don't give us money, we will open the gates. And it's been fairly understood. Like Libya understood this. Both governments in Libya understood this. Egypt has understood this. Tunisia has understood this. That like there is not just a business, but there's like political capital in that. The specifics as to why Morocco would open the border now, I'm happy to kind of concede that I'm not 100% certain yet. I think there's an argument to be made of like Occam's razor in the sense that like what is the simplest explanation, and it's probably the accurate one. In the sense that that's a way of putting political pressure on Spain. Why? That's what I think we'll probably figure out if we will eventually. The Israel angle for me is sort of like, yeah, Israel is an ally of Morocco. Israel and Spain are not on the best of terms. That's true, but why does that have to, like, it's still Morocco's border. It's
Yeah,
still
yeah.
Morocco as a state, and the state of Morocco, this monarchy, which has been unpopular for a while now, and there's been multiple protests against it and whatnot, has agency. The Israelis do not control the border between Morocco and Ceuta. It's Morocco and obviously Spain on the other side.
And in
Like
a
that
way,
that's
that
something
kind
that
of,
has to be, yeah, like reckoned with a bit. There's
yeah,
a very like flattening of the discourse because it has to fit in like something immediate, and it just doesn't
yeah.
sometimes.
And something that already exists that people are primed for. And here, I think, because we're talking about English speaking social media, we're mostly talking about Americans who don't know that much about Europe or about migration and about like the 20 years development of Fortress Europe. Or, yeah, for instance, I mean, or younger people that I do want to be fair with who have been radicalized around Palestine. And so then, like, that's how they understand kind of the rest of the world.
Sure.
And the links are usually there. But yeah, one of the problems with this is you kind of let the Moroccan monarchy off the hook for its own oppression, for its own, for instance, as a colonial power that occupies the Western Sahara. It's
Hmm.
not, a regime that is like, reactionary because it's signed the Abraham Accords. It's been reactionary since it's
Or long
kind of,
before that.
yeah, yeah, and for reasons that have to do with its own state power, its own class domination, its own whatever.
Hmm.
And yeah, like you said, like I think it was like 2018. The reason that I felt like it'd be good for us to talk a little bit is because we do have a bit more experience. We're very frustratingly, I think we're both in denial that we're kind of elders in a small way.
I have
There are
enough
things
white hair now. I cannot deny it anymore.
I know, but I just find myself anyway, whatever. So 2018, I think, after the 2015 so-called refugee crisis, where it was like 2 million refugees fleeing situations of war, mostly from Syria and Iraq and
Mm-hmm.
Afghanistan, coming into Europe, there was this massive panic. Like the things that you're saying are now like so commonplace, the right wing reaction and the fascist reaction, that didn't exist back then. It started to exist. Like that was
Mm-hmm.
one of the moments where they really seized on it, and those images really started to circulate again in terms of uh, placing it within a narrative of an invasion. These are all young, military age men, is what they'd always say,
Yeah. Yeah.
which fits in very clearly with great replacement theory, with this
Mm-hmm.
idea that there is this concerted plot. Um, Again, this is why it's very problematic that people jump to this thing being super coordinated and then in line with like basically trying to, overthrow Europe, to replace all the whites of Europe with immigrants and migrants and
Mm-hmm.
whatever.
Mm-hmm.
Super problematic. This is my main angle, and it's definitely just for the images alone. What I find very interesting, actually, I wanted to say in my like last before I finish my last thing, is again the problem with the takes is this video or this episode, we're technically a bit late.
Yeah.
Like I've noticed very quickly this massive thing that happened, people rush to give their takes, and then the next big thing happens, and
They
it's a part of the yeah.
There's no doubt that the fact that we're going to release it on August, today's August the 3rd, like today or tomorrow, very likely means that we have lost like I don't know 80% maybe of the potential listens. That's just
Yeah.
how it is now. And if we had done this exact same thing immediately afterwards, or as it's happening, as so many people have, obviously, it would be very different. And
Yeah.
that's just one of the, and I'm just not comfortable doing that, except if I'm
No.
already comfortable that I like if it's on Lebanon, maybe I might. Like I'm just comfortable, I know enough. But even then, there have been
Yeah.
so many cases where like even you and I have waited a bit, like, and it's
Mhm.
on Lebanon, like we didn't have to research anything new or anything like that. We're just like, just in case, let's wait a bit because who knows? And I'm someone who's always been paranoid about being like wrong about something fundamental and
Mhm.
whatnot, which doesn't mean I haven't been. I have, and I correct myself. But just to at least try and do my due diligence and whatnot. It's something that is for the most part completely out of the window. The
Yeah.
other thing
And
is
it's why.
that
Yeah.
no, please go.
No, I wanted to say on that point, it's a structural issue because
Yeah.
there's more incentive on social media and on streaming platforms, especially. Like, this thing was happening when people were live on stream, and so they're immediately giving their takes, even though they're not the person to be listening to from. Is that they really incentivize like speed over accuracy. They're more like you're more incentivized to say something quickly and potentially harmful or controversial or whatever than to take your time and do the more, so this is what actually happened. These are the nuances. This is the context. Which, yeah,
Yeah. So a few things. Two main things really. One, if we can, I don't know which one to do first. Let's talk about the whole great replacement thing first to kind of get it
yeah,
out of the way because listeners of this podcast, maybe statistically speaking, have heard of it, the whole conspiracy theory. But I still want to kind of give it its due because it's one of those things that has become normalized or
mm,
increasingly normalized in mainstream discourse, certainly in the UK and I know in the US as well. As far as I can tell, elsewhere too. I don't know to what extent in different places. Without people really knowing the details of A, where it comes from, and B, what's actually implied when people say like they're coming, quote unquote, they are coming to replace us.
mm,
The where it comes from is pretty straightforward. It's an anti-Semitic trope. It's not a new one. It's actually a very, very old one. It's just been kind of rehashed and recycled for the modern era. The essential, the kind of the belief of that, at the core of that conspiracy theory, is that like a cabal of Jewish people are organizing for one reason or another, usually the main reason being to quote unquote replace the whites of Europe, are coordinating these waves of migration. And then these are like retroactively inserted depending on how far back like those conspiracy theories want to go. So they can talk about, of course, the quote unquote crisis of 2015. Some of them go back to like, Turkish immigration in Germany in like the 70s and 80s. Some go further back to like Algerians in France in like the 50s and 60s and so on. And the idea is that, there is such a thing as a untouched virgin Europe, essentially.
mm,
and that is being, and this is very gendered and uncomfortable to talk about, but it is part of that discourse that is being invaded. And it is
Mm.
very gendered, as you mentioned, like, military aged males and so on and so forth. Like, that is actually part of the thing. I remember in 2015, during the so-called crisis, you had like one of those French cartoons, for example, because La Marianne, the symbol of France, is a woman. And so
Yeah.
you had very horrible things being done to that woman by essentially like, vaguely brown and black men.
Mm.
This is not, oh, the Statue of Liberty, of course, is a woman, and that's that sort of thing in the US. So that's why personally, whenever there is the like Israel did this, I always have the like, let's wait a minute, like pause a sec. Like, what are we actually saying here? And how do we risk, even if one doesn't intend to, there's lots of very good reasons to be extremely skeptical of anything Israel does within Israel
Mm.
Palestine and even outside of Israel Palestine. Lots of very good reasons to do so. But when does it cross into something that is very, very potentially problematic? And even if we're not aware of it, like, what is the damage that we can do? And that's
Yeah.
that's why, like, sort of like, as someone who's like on the left and who's also very concerned about anti-Semitism and so on, that's sort of like, and who's also like, also fuck Israel, but who's also like very concerned about like how all of this is playing out. This is where I come on that. I want to talk then about like the whole crisis in Fortress Europe and whatnot, but let's just dig
Yeah, yeah,
deeper
yeah.
on that a
No,
bit.
again, I think this exact same way. And a part of how I've been thinking about it is that it's, anti-Semitism in the way that we understand it here, it's an invention of racist white Christian
Mm-hmm.
European men,
Mm-hmm.
that there's this attempt to essentially, I mean, kind of launder their whiteness or like ignore that it's them doing the thing. As in here, when we immediately jump to thinking, okay, how's Israel connected, or how are this cabal or whatever potentially like omnipotent, invisible thing, we then forget to actually question white supremacy
Yeah.
and white supremacist Europe. And like, for instance, why is there such a militarized border? Why are there so many people, trying to get to Europe? Why are all these places impoverished and underdeveloped and colonized, and overexploited? Like, this is a history of white colonialism. And there's just the reason that I was so a bit frustrated initially, because it's come on the back of several things. And most recently with the forest fires in Canada, I just do see a lot of comments. Like, I don't know how indicative this is of people, but who are like, instantly, there are wildfires in Canada, and it's like, how's Israel connected to this?
Yeah.
And I can't not see that in a kind of thing of like this, like super omnipotent, international Jew who's, causing wildfires in Canada. Which again, the main thing for me, it's a massive distraction of A, the very serious climate emergency we're in, and B, the history of like 100, 150, 200 years of white European industrialism, capitalism, that are destroying the planet. It gets completely lost. It's a part of anti-Semitism is it's a distraction from the violence, the fascism, the capitalism and imperialism of white men.
No, it was called the socialism of fools like over a century ago.
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I think it was
Yeah.
Luxembourg who said that.
The
There you go.
socialism of fools. And so, yeah, it's come on the back. I mean, even there was like an earthquake in Venezuela where thousands were killed. And there was just instantly this, how can we pin this on Israel? And I'm just like, kind of, it's, and
I
a
wish
big
I could.
problem, again, because we're on social media. No, I just want to say this point, they could all be bots. Like,
Oh yeah.
it's got, the discourse has gotten to this point because people are talking to bots and the bots do exist, that it's all bot level, Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, that's like a whole other can of worms.
Yeah.
There is like, so a couple of things, and maybe then I'll shift to like the why I'm so worried about Fortress Europe. As
Yeah.
someone who is, well, technically just outside of it, because I don't know how the UK fits into it, but I mean, it's part of the same infrastructure. You're inside it.
Yeah.
Okay, but before I get into Fortress Europe, the thing about downplaying even like completely sidestepping and ignoring the agency of the Moroccan government here is that you end up like making their life so much easier. And this is something that
Mm.
like Arab regimes, for example, have done in the past. We know the Egyptian one and the Syrian ones, for example, under whether it's Sisi, whether it's Bashar al-Assad or whatnot, while like using Israel to distract essentially from their own crimes and their own, problems and so on and so forth. It's not, that's what I'm saying. For me, there's just this element of like I need to also remind myself that maybe not everyone knows this because it's just such an old thing, and maybe as you said, we are elders at this point. But it's like people need to really pay attention to this, or they need to at least be very careful because, and there is an emotional component to this, right? There isn't like Israel has gotten away with a literal genocide for nearly
Yeah.
3 years now, and with like war crimes and crimes against humanity for a longer period of time as well.
Yeah.
And there is an element of like people even emotionally, and here I'm trying to be as nuanced as I can because I'm not describing everyone here, but there is a component of that. I've seen it even in some people I've met and so on, of like being so injured, like spiritually, emotionally, whatever, by the fact that Israel has gotten away with it for so long, that there is a sense of like if you don't find a way to blame it on Israel, it's as if you're betraying the Palestinians,
Mm.
as if you're downplaying the Israel's genocide or anything like that. And I get how that can be complicated. I'm not trying to downplay it, but we still need to be very, very careful when we do that. You and I have, of course, talked about this also in the past in terms of like how Iran would be talked about in these situations, even before this most recent war. But with this war, like the fact that Iran is, of course, the one that's under attack, that is true, and that does mean that in this them versus Israel and America, it is Israel and America that are the quote unquote bad guys. But
Mm.
Iran as a regime is an extremely brutal and violent regime that has even found the time, even as it's being attacked, to still execute innocent people.
Mm.
And this is something that, like, if we don't somehow find a way to hold both of those things, there's actually more than two, of course, but in our minds, we're letting down a lot of people. And we're kind of already, one of the things that really concerns me is that it's sort of already accepting that there is no possibility for internationalism, that the closest thing we
Yeah.
can do essentially is like different camps fighting one another, and we're just hoping to weaken one camp and the hope that the other camp is slightly less bad or whatnot. And that's like the whole actually existing multipolar polarism or polarity or whatever people call it these days. That's what concerns me, and we see
Yeah.
it play out every time this happens. Like every time there is, like, I don't know if when Turkey threatened to open, well, they did actually open the border at one point with Greece like years ago. There was
Mm.
also this a lot of people not understanding that, like, yes, of course the way Greece reacted is really fucked up, and of course the way the EU has been militarizing the border is extremely fucked up, and this is the next thing I want to get into in a bit. But you need to also understand that Turkey is an authoritarian government that has its own reasons for doing things, regardless of what you may or may not think about. It's really important to keep that into account because otherwise we're just ironically reinforcing a Western centric worldview, despite the fact
Mm.
that a lot of the people who engage in that flawed thinking, to put it extremely generously here, wouldn't see themselves as that. A lot of those people, they would call themselves anti-imperialist, maybe anti-colonial, all of that stuff, and yet this gets reproduced.
Yeah. No, and it's especially true in again in that way where my main thing these days is just can we be a bit clear about our positions or our understanding of the situation? Can we just learn a bit and be a bit curious? So like obviously there's that example of Turkey in 2018. They got this massive Erdogan got this massive like I think $4 billion from the EU, and it was just a very clear thing. Like he was weaponizing these Syrian refugees predominantly and
Mhm.
threatening Europe. But then there's that question of why is Europe so threatened? Why is this a weapon that, works
Why is it
against
that
them?
easy?
And
Why is it
why
that
is that
easy?
easier? That is at it. And the more clear example was a few years ago with Belarus, or the
I was
border
thinking
with
of that too,
Poland.
yeah.
Yeah, yeah. This was the more like literal example where it was also clearly coordinated, and they did openly push people or like accept, like allow people to cross into Poland, whatever. But again, the question remains: why is it such a vulnerability? Why is even if at the time like 1 million refugees into Europe? Why is that the existential crisis perceived existential crisis that is not put onto the climate emergency, to fascism, to AI, bullshit, kind of like draining everyone's resources, to imperialism, nuclear war. Like it's very frustrating that, and it gets whitewashed again because this is a racist white project and this is reaffirming fascism that, Spain, like, because that was the position that even the Spanish prime minister or president Sanchez had to perform in terms of this was an attack on our sovereignty, And there has been this shift, I remember so well in 2015, and since then, this constant shift to the right when it comes to immigration. And now in the UK, it's an agreed upon amongst all the political parties, except for maybe the Green Party, this idea of, push back the boats, the small boats, as though this is actually the thing that's going to make or break our existence, when it's not. And it's not. And there are other things that are happening right now that are, this was what I wrote about. And the only thing I did write about this situation was on my Instagram. But I want to say one other thing, which is that, again, these days online, I'm very much like, can we just talk? Can we just actually talk honestly and real? Because I have an article that I'm like an essay that's kind of like building my mind, which is titled, The Most Interesting Thing About Campists Are the Things They Don't Say. Because I actually think there's an argument to be made that like Iran as a military power is a countervalence to Israel, and especially this coming as a Lebanese person, right? But that doesn't mean, but it is also an oppressive, theocratic, fascist regime that does murder dissidents. But like what campists do is, because they can't hold that position, or I don't know if they want to call it a contradiction, so they just paint it as like, oh no, it's actually socialist. Oh no, it's actually like great. It's actually fine. Everything that you hear about it is just Western propaganda. But it's like, no, the real like stance, the real position is that it is like, let's not look at it through rose-tinted glasses. It is an authoritarian regime. And it is a military countervalence to Western imperialism in the region. Like, that's a real position. We can argue, we can debate about it. It's not a very, but it's like a more realistic, actually grounded in what it is, aside from then talking about, no, it's actually anti-imperialist and whatever, because then it gets delusional and it starts getting like argument over facts or sources. And so that's what I find this problem with, where we're not actually talking about the same shared reality. And so likewise here, like when we're talking about Morocco isn't just a client of the US or whatever. It's its own power structure. It's its own history. It's its own bullshit. It has its own bourgeoisie and blah, blah, blah.
In fact, one way to know this is like, you mentioned Sanchez, and which doesn't surprise me. He is the president, but in terms of like, it's like an attack on our sovereignty, right? An attack by who? They don't name who is doing the attacking. If it is the Moroccan state, that's a specific political accusation, but one which of course has consequences. And so for the most part, they don't say those unless they're in the opposition, because they're not the ones in power. Then it's easier for them to say these things. And one of the reasons they don't say that is because in many ways, and this is something the Moroccan government understands, and as I said, they're not the only one in our region, they need Morocco. They need Morocco not just for a lot of the greenwashing that is being done, a lot of which happens on occupied Western Sahara territory for that matter, but they need Morocco because Morocco is one of the gates preventing people like us in our thousands and hundreds of thousands and whatever from polluting Europe. You have centrists in Europe that have, of course, described Europe as a garden and the rest of the world as a jungle. You have this, I forgot what his name, one of the Dutch, I think he would be considered a centrist, saying something along the lines that we need to control our border, we need to secure our external border in order to secure our internal borders, and so on and so forth. And yet, Spain, for example, did technically secure this external border, and it did not stop Italy and I believe Denmark for like a period of time from canceling the Schengen, as if like everyone who entered Ceuta were on their way to Copenhagen or whatever. It's this sort of reaction where these external pressures, I'm not saying they're not there. I'm not one of those. I'm not here to argue that like if a million people who are not from here are suddenly here, that's not a quote unquote situation. Sure, it is. There's resource allocations, there's stuff to be done, there's things to be figured out, and etc. etc. But for it to be turned into a crisis, there has to be something internal first and foremost that is weakening, that is weak, that is structurally problematic. And this is where Europe has, and I can give you a better, even like concrete ways in which this can be like demonstrated if you want. 50,000 people is a number we're talking about now. And as I said, the vast majority of whom have already been returned to Morocco. But in terms of the response online, for example, and politically by like dozens of political parties throughout Europe, it's not that different than if a million people had entered Ceuta. It's actually not that different because all that matters is like the visual of it. You need like a few seconds, maybe a few minutes at most, of videos showing like, I don't know, the entire coastline from like a specific angle being overrun or whatnot, or like the gates being open. That's really all you need. You don't, it doesn't even, it could be like only 200 people, but that's not how it shows online, for example. And that has the same sort of reaction than if it was quite literally a million people.
And
And
again,
this
a
is
million
something that,
people entering the Iberian Peninsula, like the European continent. Like that
yes,
doesn't show in the
exactly.
photo where it's like, no, this is still in North Africa.
This is still in North Africa, exactly.
Yeah.
And
And
yeah,
I mean,
so
again, we're old enough to remember 2015 and then the Brexit referendum. And there were politicians who are now still around and now, if anything, more powerful than ever, like Nigel Farage. Well, debatably, but his,
yeah, yeah.
reform and UKIP and whatever, standing in front of billboards with those images from 2015 of migrants. And what was it? It was like it's an invasion, or that like we should use this money instead internally,
Yes,
which obviously they
yes,
never
yes,
intended
yes, yes.
to.
They basically said like we're sending all of that money to the EU and said we can fix the NHS.
Yeah.
And you had a bunch of people who quite literally, and this happened on the day of, I was there, I was in London on like the day of the vote and the coming days, who were being interviewed and who said like I have no they voted for Brexit. And they said like I have no problem with all of these Europeans, EU coming, but I have so many problems with like Afghans and Syrians and whatnot. But my friend, you just voted to leave the EU, not to leave Afghanistan. And this is like, but it doesn't matter, of course. Like again, there is an element in which it's a very emotional thing. It's not like you can't out reason these sort of situations and whatnot. But like these people don't listen to this podcast or whatever. One of the things that I want to maybe as a way of like slowly wrapping up is talking about this securitization, this fortress Europe, which for me, I wrote this article in 2020, which had the unfortunate timing of being like 3 or 4 days. It was published 3 or 4 days before like COVID-19 was declared as a pandemic. So like no one read it basically. But it was on Byline Times at the time. And the argument I made, which I genuinely don't think was a particularly like revolutionary or radical argument, was pretty straightforward and very mild in my view, is that the EU will have to figure out how to, at the very least, slowly phase out Fortress Europe, if not entirely dismantle it. Otherwise, it's not that the rest of the world will stop trying to come to Europe. And even I'm going to take a step back here, because the rest of the world is not trying to go to Europe, but there's going to be people from other parts of the world trying to go to Europe for various reasons, whether it's global warming, whether it's like economic pressures or whatever, or fleeing, of course, war and authoritarianism and so on. But a couple of things that is not being often talked about on the European side is that how much resources is being spent and deployed, and what are some of the boomerang and repercussions for within Europe? All of that technology, this securitization, this perfecting drones and AI and all of that stuff to monitor bodies that are mostly like black and brown. That technology doesn't get stopped at the border. This is so frequent now that it almost feels like a cliche and pointless to point it out. But Palestine has been a laboratory for a while now for a reason. Is because Israel then sells that technology elsewhere. The same happens for those companies like Frontex, which is the border agency of Europe, that also needs to find ways to show that it is being efficient, that is being how do they do that? By deporting more people, by breaking the law, by like at the very least diluting people's human rights, if not completely rejecting them, by finding loopholes, by saying actually you cannot claim asylum if you enter here because here technically doesn't quite matter, or you have the Dublin Accords and you have like well you take one, we take one, and stuff like that. What does that actually? This is an infrastructure. This is a thing that is well, multiple infrastructures that is being developed, and yes, first and foremost being used against people that look like us. But it doesn't stop there. Why would it? It has never been the case that a state that has developed certain types of weapons and ecosystems of power or systems of power, whatnot, that they're going to like stop using it because you are a citizen. Now we have a far right party that's to the right of reform, restore, that has no problem saying actually among the people we want to deport are also just citizens of the UK. They're not sufficiently British. Like at some point, once we accept that the overtone window can be shifted to the right and then further and further and further, who's going to actually say, well, okay, let's just stop here. This is enough right wing. This is enough. It's the furthest we can go to the right. There's no reason why it would. It would just continue, continue, continue until it collapses. So my worry is not that it's gonna not collapse ever. My worry is just how much suffering is happening in the meantime. Just things, people who are drowning just because, all of that. So anyway, I'm rambling a bit, but that's where I'm at. That's sort of like part of my own. Um, I posted this thing on Substack, and a couple of the responses. One person is pro Moroccan monarchy. It doesn't matter. They're not gonna listen to this. The other person said something that for me is very revealing, because I said in my piece on my newsletter that I showed, like, of course, like Ukrainian refugees were treated differently than Syrian refugees. Although I was also careful to put in between parentheses, this does not mean that Ukrainian refugees had it good or whatever. Of course, they also faced a lot of difficulties, including like xenophobia by a number of like European governments and so on. But the person that responded said, like, "Oh, how shocking that Europeans would treat Europeans differently than they would Syrians." And I didn't respond because I don't have patience for this thing. But like, Habibi, my man, my friend, I don't know the gender, whatever. It's 5 seconds ago that Ukrainians started being considered Europeans by Western Europe. I'm sorry, you need to pay a bit. You need to pay some attention here. A lot of the Brexit xenophobia was barely about us. It was about Poles and
Mm.
Romanians and Ukrainians and Russians for that matter. The hatred and xenophobia against Eastern Europeans and Western Europe is old. Suddenly it's been memory hold now because Putin invaded Ukraine and now he's the scarier east whatever. Like, this is just one of those things that a lot of people have either forgotten or maybe they don't know or whatnot, because it's like, I don't know, they're not old enough, whatever it might be. But it frustrates me. Generally does. A lot of people have been discriminated against for being Eastern European in Western Europe. It's a very old thing. Anyway, I'll stop at that.
No, there's obviously a lot of things we could say, and there are. I'll say like a few last things, and I guess we might wrap up. I met my partner, who's now my partner, I'll say, um, in 2015, and they're white, European, and I remember we did get into a few kind of like difficult conversations around the so-called refugee crisis, right? And I do remember the one thing that I said that really shifted um, their thoughts, which is that by very, very, very simple, easy shift of circumstances, I could be one of those people. Like, there is actually no reason except for luck of birth that I'm not one of these people. That I was born into a wealthier family, that like I could go and study abroad and then meet you here legally, and that's the one thing that I've seen shift emotionally, that ability to sort of recognize the kind of shared humanity, or that, like, because breaking from this idea that it's all these young men from a foreign culture, and as they say, like a toxic culture that's incompatible with the West or whatever. The symmetries between Islamophobia, xenophobia, and anti-Semitism in Europe has a very long history. And the ways that European racists talked about Jews, especially in the heyday of European racism in like the 1930s, it's very much like the Turk over here, like the other that's inside.
Yeah.
And so it's very, very toxic ideologies that have become very mainstream and very normalized across Europe. And it does a disservice to combating those fascist parties and those far-right neo-Nazi parties and movements and groups and people, by not taking the time to understand issues of migration, issues of like, and then this is the last point I want to get into, is that there's a laziness that comes with it. Like I said at the beginning, that it whitewashes white people or like white Europe and like the history of European colonialism and industrialization. That there is in some cases, we can talk a bit abstractly. I remember in 2015, Slavoj Žižek, who wrote too much at the time, and some of it was really, really poor and really bad and really reactionary. He did write one thing which was correct, which was, if we do not fix the problem of global capitalism, then these refugee crises, these flows of whatever, will continue. Because where is this coming from? Why are all these people fleeing? Not just war situations, but what they're called economic migrants. But why are these places impoverished to begin with? A lot of it has to do with European colonialism and European neo-colonialism. It hasn't ended. The third world debt crisis, the IMF and the World Bank. And like, this obviously takes a lot of time to go through, but there's a lot of reasons that Europe is still complicit, that America's complicit, that, that the so-called West in fomenting and causing these so-called crises or like waves of migration, but in a much more literal sense, that the Moroccan government, monarchy, is not just propped up by the US and Israel, it's propped up by Europe, by Europeans, specifically by far-right Europeans. Only recently, Tunisia is another example, under this so recent guy, I keep forgetting his name, had this big conference, anti-migration conference with Meloni, with all of the European ministers and the right-wing parties and whatever. In Sudan, there was this notorious, I think it was called the Khartoum process, in which I think it was about 200 million euros were given to the Sudanese government, which was in large part then given to the RSF in order to curb migration from Sudan. And we saw how that played out. That these are the exact same forces that then caused greater waves of migration. These are the exact same governments and exact same economies, that there's this really toxic cycle that the European right wing, that the states endorses, supplies, supports and does deals with. And then, the biggest example of this is Israel, as a kind of European outpost of like, it does many things, but a part of it is like keep people there, like don't, the state of Lebanon, Turkey, all of them. And that's why I was going to write this. I probably won't after this episode because I feel like I got from this episode. Is that when I think about the so-called Great Migration, like the Great Replacement theory, is this really a nightmare or is this their fantasy? Like, is this the kind of thing that the fascists and the far right would love to have? Because then it obviously then feeds into their propaganda and they can ascend to power and whatever. And ultimately, when we're talking about fascism, like you said, it'll come for all of us. And like the climate emergency is showing, it's going to come for all of us. And so you can't have an insular European problem to such a historic global phenomenon that Europe also is complicit in. It's not an island unto itself. And so that's where I think a lot about with this thing in Morocco and Spain, but also with Poland and Belarus, with Turkey and the so-called Balkan route, Libya and the Mediterranean. It's been a tendency and a trend that we have seen in real time since 2015. And it's not looking good,
Yeah. Just I'll
Um,
end on a few notes.
yeah.
And kind of a way of proving a lot of what we just said essentially is that this is from infomigrants.net that with funding from Italy and Malta, something called a maritime rescue center, quote unquote, is going to be set up in Benghazi in eastern Libya, in territory controlled by Khalifa Haftar's forces, whose government is actually not recognized by the EU. But it's just to say that questions like sovereignty, like, earlier we mentioned attack on our sovereignty, and so on and so forth. These are things that, for the most part, the EU and the European countries and whatnot just doesn't care about when it comes to the rest of the world. They're certainly not its immediate neighbors. And it's something that, like, if the rest of the world, especially, let's say, North Africa and the Eastern Mediterranean, because those are the kind of the elephants in the room here, in a sense, whenever we talk about migration in Europe, if they're not worthy, if there's no deserving of their own, not that I'm here to romanticize the nation state, but like by that own logic, of their own nation states with rules and regulations and like international humanitarian law and human rights law and so on and so forth applicable to them as well and to the individuals within those territories, then the EU has also essentially accepted that the only way forward is to just put up more and more and more walls, more fences, more militarized death zones, essentially, because that's what a lot of the Balkan route has already become, for that matter, and so on and so forth. And I'll end on that because in some ways it's a repetition, but just to maybe emphasize this specific point, which is that given how things are going, there is no reason to believe that there won't be many a migrant, quote unquote, migrant crisis in the months and years and decades to come. Global warming is the obvious one of the obvious reasons, but there might be other reasons like a major government like the Egyptian one who has been allied with the EU for like over a decade now, something happens to whatever, etc., etc. There are so many different scenarios here that can lead to people taking the risk and trying to cross into the EU. And one thing that I have not seen, and I do think I've searched thoroughly, I have not seen really mentioned in most places. There's been like comments here and there, which is that right now Europeans in the EU are complaining a lot about a lot of people wanting to come here, so to speak. I don't think there is an understanding of how bad the situation has to get for people to no longer want to come here. And that's actually a worse scenario than anything that they can worry about right now. We're talking about global warming, the wildfires in France and Spain, the droughts in fucking Wales, one of the wettest places in so like the wildfires where my partner's from in Italy and so on and so forth. If it gets to the point where Europe itself is also that risky and that dangerous and whatnot, uh, lots of people won't want to come and whatnot. And maybe then, okay, cool, the far right has won, that discourse won. I wouldn't want to live in that world. And I don't think people who seem to desire that somehow are fully cognizant of what that actually would entail.
There is, I mean, this is a tiny footnote. I wanted to put it in there, but there's an
Mm.
interesting thing that I think I haven't seen anyone talk about, which is the already existing constant migration between Morocco and Spain. And this is especially interesting for people in Europe. Spain is what's called Europe's breadbasket, right? Like we have fruits and veg all year round, and so much of it comes from Spain. And it comes from
Yeah.
very few areas in Spain. And most of those workers are Moroccans. Moroccans who get like seasonal visas, who get to come and go, you know? And I don't know, there was a little footnote, but yeah, there's like a nuance, but also like an understanding of the back and forth flows of migration, the necessity and the benefit of like migration that already exists. Like I'm not talking theoretically. But yeah, Fortress Europe, the problem is it's assuming that all it needs to do is put up its walls and it's fine. But there are crises within it, super, super crises, existential crises that I know there are a lot of people focused on and are dealing with it, but it is also interconnected with the fight against fascism. Um, and yeah, it's true. Like I said, there's a boomerang effect where it's like people are less free now because of what they tacitly accept on their border and tacitly accept of what happens over there. I do like to think of walls as having more to do with those inside of them and like controlling and whatever. There's a theorist, there's stuff there. I don't know if this is Foucault, but like controlling those that are within the borders as opposed to stopping those from outside, you know? It's a duality. Anyway, that's it.
Yeah, I just thought there's a song called "Why We Build the Wall" by Anais Mitchell that comes to mind. There's a bit of like, we build the wall to keep us free, and what is it? We build the wall to keep us free. The enemy is poverty, and we keep the
Oof.
wall to keep out poverty. Something like that. Like essentially,
Yeah.
like we're keeping the problems away by building,
Yeah.
essentially by building the wall or something along those lines. Anyway, Tab. Ayman, thanks so much for doing this. It actually went longer than what we initially planned, but this is what we tend to do.
Yeah.
I'll release this very quick, obviously, because it's time sensitive. But hopefully, folks who have listened to this get something out of it. I'll include as many useful links as I can in the description because neither of us are coming here as like the experts. We just had something specific that I do think was worth sharing, and hopefully, it helps informs further, you know, and so on. Which is the best I can hope for from like a podcast. Anyway, thanks a lot for doing this, Ayman.
Thanks for having me.